I think that when I started doing these podcasts, I've just been doing it with just gay Black men. And I heard from you guys, and they're like, "Hey, we need more diversity. We like what you're doing. We get it, but we want to hear more stories. We want to hear different things." And I've been doing that. I brought you guys Monifa a couple of weeks ago. I brought you guys Big Frida, Miss Lawrence, but today it's gonna be my first time. We've had T.S. Madison, but this is our first time we're gonna have a conversation with trans men. And I know a lot of women or a lot of people in general may not know what that is. And that is from female to male. We all know about male to female because that's what's more widely publicized in the media. But today we'll be talking to female to male today. So I'm interested because I'm open to learn and hear this journey and have this conversation, and we're going to do that today. So I would like to introduce to you guys Marquise Vilsón. Hey, Marquise.
Hey, Derek, how are you?
I am well. How are you doing?
I'm all right, to say the least, considering the climate of the world and just everything else going on, but I'm okay.
Good. So I know many of you have known each other, but we haven't really had a chance to really talk to each other, hang out with each other as much as we would like. But I remember the first time, which you may not remember this, but I remember the first time I was not introduced to you, but I met you and I didn't understand what was going on. And it was after Marquette, a Halloween night. And we were at the bar together and we just had we was having a conversation together. And you mentioned that you were a trans man. And I was with Christian. I said, child, that man is fine, child. He talking about some trans man. Didn't know what he was talking about. And Christian was like, do you know what that is? I was like, no, girl, but whatever. It don't matter to me. But that's when I was like, oh, shit. Like, you were one of the first people that I even knew that world even existed.
Yeah.
But now we're here. So the first question I would like to ask, and I ask all of my guests, is that if you can wrap yourself up in 3 words, what would those 3 words be?
3 words. I'm always evolving. Mm-hmm. I think in my life's experience, which is pretty layered, the intersections of my identity, of my experiences, through Blackness, through transness, through being assigned female at birth, and also walking in the world being read as a man. Mm-hmm. I feel like for me, my existence is always about evolving. Mm-hmm. Like there's something new. There's something else that's growing, that's changing. So
I like that. See, some people, when I ask that question, some people give me a sentence like that, or some people they try to give me 3 separate words. Like they make this question really more harder than what it really is.
I watched a couple of your other episodes, so I got the sense of like what that was, but I had to really think about it. So I was like, oh, wait a minute. So yeah, no, I love the question though.
And you know what? This is so crazy. One of my clients, Grenade Barenko, just popped in the room. She said SVU. She put it in big old exclamation marks.
Oh, okay.
So people know who you are. People see.
Okay.
So I want to, like I said, we want to start from the beginning as always, and that beginning for you is a way different than who you are today, yes. Right? Like you said, you were assigned female, and I like that you said that's the terminology that you use. That you were assigned female yes. at birth.
Yes.
You know. So when you were growing up, when did you know that there was something different about you?
Well, before we get into it, one, I want to say thank you for extending your platform. I think that this is amazing. I'm very aware of your audience. I know that you're largely connected to Black communities and specifically Black cis women, straight women. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a great way to bridge a lot of gaps. Mm-hmm. Also doing that internally within the queer plus, larger LGBTQ community, because we don't really share a lot of space. So actually, I just want to say kudos to you. I think this is amazing.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you for being here.
But your question was, when was the first time that I knew that I was different?
Yeah.
I think I noticed more so when other people did. You know, I don't know that I ever processed that I was different more than I was just existing. Like I was just being my authentic self. And it wasn't until other people let me know that that made them uncomfortable. I want to say my earliest recollection was probably with my father before he was murdered. My father was murdered or killed rather when I was 7. But prior to that, I was maybe like 5 or 6, and I was climbing a tree one day. And he saw me climbing this tree. He walked over, he grabbed me, he gave me a spanking and told me that girls don't climb trees. Well, I guess he was right. But that was probably like one of the most earlier experiences that I had, where there was this suggestion that somehow, because of this assignment that I had that was placed on me at birth, that there were limitations around the way that I could express myself, the way that I could behave socially in the world. And I think maybe the second time that I experienced that was with my peers, and I was probably like 8 or 9 years old. I grew up here in the Bronx. My family's originally from here, from the Bronx, and I lived in Edenwald Projects. And we used to have this pool on the south side of Edenwald. It's called the Big Park. And the boys would go to this pool, and they'd be flexing and doing all this crazy shit, showing their muscles. And I started doing the same thing. Here I am, 8, 9 years old. I didn't think anything of it. And I remember the language. I remember what people would say, like Butch, Dyke, you know, and that was the moment that I recognized that, wait a minute, something about the way that I'm showing up in the world is a problem for someone else. So it was never a problem for me more than it was for other people.
So during those stages, so when for you, because I don't understand how the mind works. So for you, when you saw yourself in the mirror, did you see a girl looking back at you, or or girl boy wasn't even a thing?
Those were not things. They weren't things that I saw. I didn't really see my gender in that way, more than I think the older I got and there were like these expectations about how I should behave. I think there's like a certain mark. You know, when you're like 11, 12 years old, it's kind of like, okay, you know, this thing that you're doing, we need to like shift this. Right. You need to behave in a really different way. And especially for my father's family, because my father's family is Black Cubans, so they're Afro-Cubano, but they practice Catholicism. They're Catholic. And so it's extremely strict. And that was one of those moments in time where I was like, okay, wait a minute. Like, I get this sort of like assignment thing that's being placed on me, but does it mean that I need to show up in the world specifically this way? You know, I think for me, those two ideas were really separate about the way that I was expressing myself. And just the way that I saw myself was just as me. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't really fully understand the scope of that. It took years for me to really process that through language, which obviously we haven't always had access to language more than just a person's experience. You just walk through your real life experience, and what that was translating to me. So you know what you were feeling, you know what you were experiencing. Yes. So when did you have a name for it? Meaning, well, I know in this space is in your space is transitions. So like when you went from having your experiences to now, I would say, I don't know what the transition would be for trans men, but what is it like? Are you a lesbian next? And then you go into like what? I'm doing my best. No, this is why platforms like this are perfect. So let me give a full disclaimer, right? One, I'm speaking from I statements. Right, yes. These are just my thoughts and my opinions and my ideas. And just per my own experience. In terms of transness, whether you're trans femme or trans masculine, there's really no template. There's not like one example of the way that you transition versus another. Buck Angel is a very close friend of mine. He's someone that I know very personally, and per his own medical transition and the space that he's in now, at some point in his life, he was married. You know, he was cis female identified. I don't think that there's any specific way to transition. And at least for me, in my own regard, yes, I've navigated, you know, lesbian space, lesbian language. And for me, like I came out pretty early. So, I mean, I was like 14 going to the clubs, you know, experiencing ballroom. Ballroom is actually like my main space, my main home. And that was as early as 1995. But per the language, there really wasn't a lot. And in fact, trans language was in Black communities something to be really, how do I say, trans femme exclusive, as if somehow if you were trans masculine, it just wasn't possible. The max that you could go was like butch. Like this was the cap.
Right.
Which I was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I know what I'm feeling. I know that like, that's not what it is, but that's as close as I could really, in terms of language, explain or wrap people's mind around the concept, because I'm masculine in presentation. But the first time that I saw a reflection of myself was 1997, and it was on Jerry Springer. And the person that was on that show was Reno Wright Prestige, Black trans man. He was trans identified at that time, and it just clicked. It was like, now I got it. Now it makes sense.
And how did that feel for you? Like when you saw, you're like, finally, I could put my like.
It was powerful. It was really, really powerful. In 1997, I was 16 years old. I had already expressed to my family that like my name is Marquise. My pronouns are he, him, his.
Oh, you did all this early.
I started my social transition very early. So I was already using male-only spaces, restrooms. If I was going to a department store and I was changing, I was going to the men's room. If I was going to the gym, I was using men's spaces. So these were things that I was already experiencing, like walking through the world. It was just this lack of language that somehow didn't really speak to my experience beyond this language of butch, which really just meant masculine.
Right.
Like that was it. But seeing Reno was like, okay, I'm not alone. I'm not the only person. And it was really informative too, because I had been in Ballroom for 2 years, and Reno, I had seen him around. I'd seen him in Ballroom, obviously, for 2 years prior to that point, but I'd never had a conversation with him. So hearing someone who came from the same community as me, who looks like me, like those were things that were like, oh my God, like I feel seen now. It may not have been the best experience in terms of like trans representation in media, of course, because it's Jerry Springer. So, you know, back then talk shows were really salacious. They asked some of the most ridiculous, disgusting questions you could think of. But just to see someone standing in their truth and living in that space as a Black trans guy was like, oh shit, like I'm here, I arrived.
Now, so from till 16, did people try to make you feel like you were crazy? Did they try to make you feel like this is a phase? Did they make you feel like it's something wrong with? It's literally something wrong with you.
Yes. That early on in life, definitely yes. Interestingly enough, I actually didn't have as many challenges within my family. You know, I come from a pretty big family just in general. My mom's family is like super huge. You know, my grandmother's the typical matriarch. What she say go. If grandma got you, that's it. You know, so a lot of people in my family per se didn't really challenge like who I was in the way that I was showing up. But I think I actually experienced more of that in community. So queer plus community at large, like the moment that I was saying that these are the ways that I identify, people were like, wait, what? But you're a girl. Like that doesn't make any sense. You know, as if somehow there was a cap on masculinity. There was a cap on my gender and the way that I could express it. You know, I definitely remember that early on, mostly experiencing that within the LGBTQ community of like, okay, wait a minute, this is too much. Like being a butch is one thing, but you talking about you trans, I don't get it.
Were they open to learning about it, or is that something you had to push?
It was something that I had to push. I don't think a lot of people were really open to learning about it. Reno in 97 was like the first time that there was like a Black trans man that was on TV. And then the next time there was like representation of trans masculinity in that specific way, or just masculine presentation in general for people of color, wasn't until the documentary from The Aggressives. So that was in 2005. That's like another 8 years later. By that time, as I'm in specifically that film, because I started raising this like conversation or bringing it into the room, I recall like dealing with lesbian women or running into folks in certain spaces that felt like, you know, that's too much. You bringing this thing up into a conversation is encouraging people. It's making folks necessarily want to transit. Oh my. There were a lot of things that I experienced around that time that was like, oh, wait, like this is clearly not my fault. I know that I'm not the only one. And I do recall like what that was like, just having experiences with people that they didn't get it. They really didn't. They didn't get it.
So now you're 16 years old. You're in the ballroom scene. You meet what's his name again?
Reno.
So now you know. So was Reno a mentor to you at 80 Point? Or,
no.
Okay, so you just saw. Okay, got you. You just saw him in the space.
Yes,
got you.
Reno is, if I'm correct, I think he's probably like almost 10 years older than me. So generationally, there was like a much larger gap. But just seeing him in general, like it spoke to me in a way that was like, oh, this resonates. This feels right. So
at 16 years old, and you knowing that, then how did you? Because this is not common knowledge. So how do you know what to do for this journey?
You mean in terms of like medical transition, social transition?
Yeah, all of that. Like what do you? Because it's like I know, like for me, the only thing I had to worry about was learning how to become a bottom or something. Like that's all.
Jesus Christ.
That's what and that. So and I understand that was a whole mess within itself. So learning. So now you're learning how to grow into a man. So like what is that experience like? I mean, and how did you do that?
In terms of, for me, so my process looked like social transition first, socially walking through the world as a man. It started there. Medical transition came for me 8 years down the line. So social transition for me started at 16, and I started my medical transition at 24.
Gotcha.
So I had lived as Marquise for an extended number of time before I got to the point and was like, okay, I'm ready to explore the options that I have available. For me back then, it took a lot of like research, asking questions. The world back then was very different than it is today. So there wasn't like, a bunch of YouTube channels that I could check out. Back then you had to go to like Yahoo and be on like Yahoo listservs. And these guys were like really secret. People were really particular about giving out certain information. But I think for me, in terms of medical transition, I researched probably for about a good 2 or 3 years. I learned what the processes were. Back then, you had to go through like the Harry Benjamin standards of law, which are centered around like gender identity disorder. So you needed to see a therapist for a year. You needed to be living as the gender you identified for a full year before you could actually go through the process of like taking hormones or doing anything else. So for me, it was a lot of research. It was a lot of kind of exploring exactly where to go and asking as many questions as I could to people who would answer them. But that was it.
You made it sound so simple.
I mean,
because and the reason I say that is because through media and through life, they paint a picture of this. They paint a picture that trans people go through this, I guess, this psychiatric mental craziness. And then they finally wake up and they make it seem like it's a very long, drawn out just moment. It doesn't seem like it's never been explained that simply, if that makes sense.
I mean, I would imagine everybody's story is going to be uniquely different to them and like who they are. At the time when I started my medical transition, I was actually living in Minneapolis. I was living there for about 2 years. And in fact, at the time, I didn't actually necessarily intend to go out of my way to ask for information. The first clinic that I went to, my primary care physician, the moment that I walked in, first of all, her nurse came in first. So they gave me this paperwork and it had questions about like, I don't know, when was your last prostate exam? Okay, so I'm just gonna leave this blank because I don't even know how to answer this question. And also, to be honest with you, I don't need to have this conversation directly with the nurse. So I didn't bother to like answer her around those specific things. When the doctor came into the office, I had that conversation with her and explained, well, so here's the deal, right? Like, yes, I identify as male. Yes, I identify as Marquise, but like I was assigned this sex at birth. And so this is where I stand. She ended up asking me on her own whether or not I was in medical transition. And if I wasn't, was that something that I was interested in? That opened up the door for that conversation to then play out and us to really like explore what that could look like. But from that moment up until the time that I actually started taking hormones, testosterone, I don't know, maybe it was like 3 months, like 3 or 4 months. So I saw her, she gave me a referral to a therapist, and then the therapist gave me a referral to an endocrinologist who's a hormone therapy specialist. And after that, that was it. The only thing I needed to learn was how to self-inject.
I was, me personally, I was ready to have this long, drawn out conversation of this. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting that.
I mean, I get it. It probably seems a lot more complex just on the surface. But
well, it seems a lot more complex. And then I don't, the way that, and it maybe just be me, but the way that it's portrayed just in the streets, and I don't know if that's the right word to use, but it's around the same space. But the way that it's portrayed in the street is almost kind of inhumane. Like the way that they make it look. And that's why I was just like, oh wait, that's it, like but it's more than that's it. But it's like, oh, okay, then so all right. Well, I want
yeah.
So on this journey, and let's talk from 16 to 24. So from 16 to 24, what was dating like for you?
16 to 24, dating was complicated. And I think mostly because during those years of my life, I was under the impression that somehow I was limited in terms of my partner choices. A lot of the women that I did date, I either A, met through Ballroom, or B, met in Black lesbian spaces. So dating was definitely kind of tricky. And not in the sense that like it was so challenging to the point that I couldn't actually meet anyone or being in a relationship. Like those things, they did happen. But there were parts of myself that I needed to be really careful about, like how much I spoke up about, or how honest and transparent I could be about my transness, about how far I wanted to go in my transition. Prior to my medical transition, I was in a relationship for like 4 years. And the girl that I was dating at that time, she identified as lesbian. Now she no longer does, but at the time she did. And when we started having conversations about medical transition, it became really uncomfortable. She was not, in that moment in time, she wasn't a fan. And so there was parts of me that felt like I needed to kind of sacrifice my transition in order to remain in this relationship, because I was in love. I didn't want to lose the person that I was with by choosing to make this decision. Of course, the moment that we broke up, I mean, within 8 months, I was like, I'm out. We're going now. Full Monty, let's do it. But for that 8-year time span, it was really tricky in terms of like having to hide parts of yourself. I definitely recall being in relationships where people felt obligated or inclined to like disclose immediately because they identified as lesbian. So they're showing up with somebody who's extremely masculine in presentation, and they're like, wait a minute, this obviously looks like a man. No, it's really da-da-da-da-da. So I think there were those kinds of challenges of like feeling like there's no control that I have over my own identity or the safety of my space, because the person that I'm seeing feels so inclined to explain themselves. And I got that part of it too. Like there was pieces of their own queerness that was being challenged through specifically my presentation, because now we're being read as a straight couple. Like that was difficult, and still is. I
mean, but visually from a heteronormal lifestyle. When like dating now, if you were out with when you're out with your partner, if it's a woman, isn't that the vision? Like, does it have to have? Does it have to have a name to it? Like, is it okay? It's okay for it to be a hetero relationship, or is that
for me?
Here's
my thing. One, this is so interesting. So, in terms of like just this conversation, I'm engaging with you this way because that is the intended purpose of this kind of space.
Yes.
I will say to your audience now, please don't go around asking trans people who they date, how they have sex, like all those things. That's really not.
Oh yeah, no, we're not going that deep.
We're not going to go that deep. Right? For me, honestly, I feel like sexual orientation or the language of what that means, like it's totally just around sexual attraction. It doesn't really speak to love.
Right.
For me, it doesn't really matter. Like I could totally care less if I have a connection with another human being. Like the way people are reading that, it's not my responsibility to coach you.
Gotcha.
You know, when it comes to like the fact that there's different people that exist in the world, there's different types of relationships. Like, yeah, that's your job. I mean, you know what I mean? There's only but so much that I can honestly do about that. But I can also say that while I might feel like that, there definitely have been people that I've dated before where that wasn't the case for them. There was a real, you know, sort of like awareness, like level of awareness around the way that they're being perceived because of the person that they're dating.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Now, during the time, still in your 16 to 24 age, were there any dark spaces during that time, as far as depression or because I know as Black people, just in general, no matter what your gender is and we function through depression, we function through mental illness because we're not supposed to have it. Like, we are strong Black people, we're not supposed to be that way. So for you, especially at that young of age, were there times for you that you had to function? Well, you functioned through it, and if you didn't function through it, did you find help for it?
There were definitely a lot of moments in my life that depression was extremely heavy. One of the ways, to be honest with you, that I felt to be like the most helpful actually was going through therapy. And I didn't realize until I was in that space how much I honestly needed it, and also what my depression was truthfully about. I think because I had suppressed my identity in so many ways, especially in regards to my relationships or per my community, that it was kind of like suffocating me. I felt really suppressed about like who I was. The moment that I finally made a decision to at least like live my life the way that I wanted to, according to my own terms, I felt that much more empowered. But I didn't realize it until I literally was in the space of talking to a therapist, you know, where they're doing this thing you're doing now, where somebody's like, tell me about your childhood. Did you get beat? You know, like these really intense conversations about like your childhood, your upbringing, what it was like. And I didn't realize how much of that I was like suppressing. Even this conversation now, you know, thinking about the relationship that I had with my father prior to him being killed, and the idea that I would have been checked in that way, like, oh, I can't even climb a tree. You know what I mean? So I definitely experienced that from those ages, but I think even more than that, prior to the age of 16 as well, all the way up until 24, before I got to a point where I was like, you know what, this is my life. You know, I need to take control. It was a selfish decision and process, you know, but I had to do what I had to do for my well-being. So
now I like you use the word selfish, because I think a lot of us look at selfish as being a negative thing. And when it's really not. But I like to ask ages a lot just to give people the time frame. But at what age did you know to be selfish? No, you're fine.
Literally, it was at 24.
Okay.
It was literally at 24. And in hindsight, I don't know that I would have taken the exact the same steps the same way. I probably still would have made a conscious decision for myself to say, like, this is the thing that I want to do. But I think now looking back on it, I might have been a little bit more inclusive with my family. I might have had more conversation with them about like what that meant. The moment that I started my medical transition, even though I had lived, you know, as Marquise for 8 years prior to that point, my family knew who that person was. They had experienced that human being. There's a really big difference when you start to introduce testosterone into your body. Like that changes a lot of things. And at the time when I had the conversation with my mother, it was probably like a week just before I was going to get my prescription. And when I said that I was going to be doing this thing, she didn't get it. She was like, well, you already look like a boy. So like, what's the difference? There's a lot of big differences that come along with that. And also I didn't live home. Like I wasn't living in New York. I lived in Minneapolis. So the way my medical transition looked to my mom, the way that it looked to my family, it seemed to be this thing that was like, okay, we're having this conversation now, and then boom. You know, everything seemed instant. My mom, I think we saw each other probably around like month 4 or month 6 of me being on testosterone, which wasn't as intimidating. Like I had maybe, I don't know, like a goatee. Like it wasn't that bad. And then, I don't know, like by month 8 or 9, when I saw her again, I had like chops and the goatee thing, and I was getting size, and she was just like,
what's going on?
Okay, wait.
Like, what did you say you was doing?
Right. She didn't get it. So if there was a way that I probably could have adjusted that, I probably would have. But I do acknowledge that like transitioning, medical transition, it is a very selfish process. You really do have to consider yourself. But if I could though, I might have been a little bit more like inviting into the space, like, okay, here's what this means. Here's how I'm going about it. Here's the research that I'm finding. You know, if I could do it all over again.
But how long did it take everybody? How long did it take your family, your immediate?
Sorry, I'm trying to charge my phone.
No, you fine. How long did it take your immediate family to understand what after the medical transitioning?
After the medical transition, my mom not that much longer. My stepfather, it took him years. It took him years. He's been in my life and in my mom's life probably since like 96. And I want to say in 2018, I think was the first time that he was like, "You're my son, and I love you as my son." I was like, "Well, who the fuck? Where the fuck was this? Like 16 years ago, you know?" So for him, it took a little bit more time. But in terms of my mom, my grandparents, my family in general, I mean, for the most part, people, they just kind of adjusted. It was like the more time went on, the more people were like, okay, like it is what it is. What are we gonna do?
So let's talk about the ballroom scene itself, because I know that that's played a role in your life, and so I have a lot of friends that's in the ballroom, but once again, I don't understand that life neither. So I just show up when they ask me to show up.
You just show up.
I just show up. But how did being in the ballroom scene affect you as far as your growth as a person?
Ballroom gave me confidence. You know, I entered into that space when I was 14 years old. You know, my life every day and what that looked like going to school was being teased and bullied for being too masculine, for being someone who was read in the world as a boy. And so the moment that I show up into this space, that's celebrated. It's over. You know, you chewing it. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some things that there's some critiques that I could have now, but I think in that moment in time as a young person who felt like there was no space that I had access to, because beyond ballroom, my life was school, my household and my grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? The neighborhood that I grew up in, there weren't a lot of people that were like me. There weren't a lot of folks that like were walking around presenting themselves in exactly the same way. So I think to be in a space like Ballroom really allowed me to feel like I was a part of a community. It allowed me to feel seen.
Mm-hmm.
It allowed me to have the confidence to walk into the world. And quite honestly, it prepared me for like what being read as cis assumed meant, or the old school term passing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like having a space like that to kind of test some of those things out in the safest way possible allowed me to kind of be able to make those adjustments in the real world, real time. Mm-hmm. If I hadn't done that at the age of 14, by the time I'm 16, going into a store, a department store like Daffy's, and using the men's changing room, I don't know that I would have had the same level of confidence if it weren't for this space that kind of prepped me. I'm not suggesting, let me be cognizant of this too. I'm not suggesting that my intention has ever been to be read as cis assumed and or past. But as a young person, there were specific spaces that I was navigating that I had never navigated a day of my life. Ballroom prepared me for that. You know, there's so many other things that I learned along the way, but I think in that moment in time, it was vital. It was vital. It was vital for me to survive. Honestly.
I like that.
And interestingly enough, that's funny. So you feel like we met at the Marquise. I feel like the first time I met you actually was at a ball.
No, that wasn't. Well, that was after the Marquette. That's when we first met. I was in costume when you met me in Halloween, so you probably even know it was me.
Oh shit!
I was in a full. I was Catwoman that year. Okay. So yeah, but then I met you the first time. Then the next time I met you was at the ball.
I think so.
Yeah, the next time I met you as me, we were at the ball, and we were at a ball. Yes. But. Okay, so like I said, and that's once again we always hear about Ballroom being a family-oriented space and things like that. But nobody, I'm not gonna say nobody has, but I haven't heard from a first-hand experience of how being in that space can help and nurture a person. You know, so that's no, because the thing is like once again, I'm not as gay as people think I am. You know, I be right in my house. I don't even know what the hell going on. I don't know.
Bro, you are dragging it today. Oh my God.
I'm not. So I learned a lot of my stuff from the gay culture, from television, honestly. And so for me, you know, when you hear about the ballroom culture, it's the story is all these runaway children that didn't have a place to go, and then now they're here at this ballroom with their family and their mother, and you know, even with like the show like Pose, that's really what the story was. Like, you know, and so that's the story I knew of Ballroom. It's like all of these lost children that have no home, they go find these mothers
and they go to ball.
Yeah,
you know what? I think that kind of like general overall premise is true, not necessarily in terms of like homelessness, but I think Ballroom is one of those places where you can find your tribe. You can just feel seen and find your tribe. You could be living at home with your parents. You could be homeless. I mean, to be honest with you, by the time I was like 14, 15 years old, I was already in the system. So those things, per my experience, are true. But I knew a lot of folks that were like living at home. They were in college. Like, really, it's just about kind of finding a sense of community that speaks to who you are. You can definitely find that through Ballroom, even without having to walk a ball. You know, I kind of get what you're saying, because it's so interesting. Ballroom, I think what has happened as Ballroom has gotten like so much more notoriety and attention, it's become just that much more performative. So people look at Ballroom as just like kind of just, it's either that or it's like super dramatic, like people stealing hamburgers or something like that from Paris is Burning, right? Like there's like these two parallels, but there's something else that happens in between. It's not just one thing or the other.
And say, you're telling me the in between. That's what. And the crazy, and I just watched my friend Mac. I just watched Paris is Burning like 3 weeks ago. I know. I know. Oh. I was like, this is a good movie. Why nobody told it was like, nigga,
it is. Forever. It really is.
I said, but it was really good. So now you're living in your adult life.
Yes.
So now you're 24. Well, we're 24 now.
Yeah.
You are on testosterone. You're doing your medical transition. So now, what does life look? What is life looking like for you now? Like what is that space of you now? Because now you are, like you said, you have facial hair now. You're getting more mass on you. You are looking like a cis Black man. You know. So how is that starting to change into your life now?
Well, how is that starting to change? I think, well, first let me say this. For my own self, I don't identify with transness like being something that's complete. Ever. That's just for me. I feel like transitioning is something that we're always going through, or at least for myself, I feel like I'm always going through some sort of transition, whether that's in work, whether that's in relationships, whether, you know, there's always something else that's coming up. Medical transition can look like a lot of different things. We can stop at certain points. We can continue to go as far as we want, whatever the case may be. But in terms of real life, like those things are constantly transitioning. And quite honestly, whether you're of trans experience or not, what it's looked like real time in terms of my walk in the world as a Black man, I mean, I'm just that much more aware. I'm just that much more concerned, which in my own experience, I've been cognizant of very early on. I mean, my father was murdered when I was 7. You know what I mean? So that's the first funeral that I'd ever gone to. And that moment in time taught me a lot about what it meant to be Black and also what it meant to be a Black man. This is 1988. You know, police don't give a fuck about Black folks, whether it's then or now. You know what I mean? Like, quite honestly, and in particular, as a Black man, there were things that just through his experience, I was being informed of, like really early on, which is one, police don't care about Black men. So his case is the typical case that you hear about Black men, where it goes from being an open case to a cold case. Like, I recognize that. And also like the way that people are kind of reading me, the information that they have about me when they're reading me in the world as a Black man, like I'm being informed through their experience and also through my own when I'm walking real time. So if I'm walking down the street late night, if it's 9, 10 o'clock at night and I see a woman coming down the same side of the street from me personally, I will cross the street. I'll walk in the middle of the street. Like all of these things that I could possibly do to make myself as small or non-threatening, you know, as possible. Those are things that it's just ongoing.
Now so I'm speaking from the naivety of society. So when people see you or meet you, when people see you and meet you on a normal day basis, is trans a conversation for you in that space? Are you that person that it's like, I'm trans, let me let you know who I am, this is what or is it?
I mean, to be honest with you, I'm an open and out trans actor, so I kind of feel like those are some things that just come along with the territory.
And so then when that comes along with the territory, you have someone that sees you, because I've had a friend of mine ask me, and I couldn't answer the question because she got into a situation. She said that, you know, she saw someone and she said, oh, he looks like a man. You know, but then they took offense to it. Like, and it's like, well, I thought, but see, in her mind, she's saying, well, I thought that was the purpose. So she thought that she was posing a compliment. So, you know, but she didn't know. So that's so,
she didn't know.
Yeah, she just didn't know. She thought that was a compliment to her, but it caused a whole kerbucket.
I think, okay, so I think I kind of follow.
Yes.
Because I've had this experience before, and I think it's all about language. I think it is. I think it's all about language. I've definitely had people find out afterwards and then go, you know, I thought you were a real man.
Oh,
okay. Stop. Flag on the play. That's not a compliment. Somebody saying to you that they thought that you were a real man, no, that's definitely not a compliment. I think it's one thing to say, well, you know, I didn't realize that you were trans, but to make comments like that, like, oh, I thought you were a real guy, or I thought you were a real girl, like those are not compliments. In fact, they actually are kind of like insulting. But I think I get it. With cis folk, they don't really know exactly what the appropriate language is. And also, you know, to the point of many trans folk, like, what is that? What does a real man look like? What does a real woman look like? People show up in the world a lot of different ways. I don't know that I'm supposed to be flattered by that or like insulted. I'm not exactly sure, because I don't show up the standard sort of like cis black male way, right? Like I know that I don't, per the way that I speak, per the way that I dress, like, but what does that even mean? You know, I don't know. I feel like there's these like nice, neat boxes that people are expected to live in that are not real, and whatever. But I think I got it. I think I got what you were saying.
Yeah, but no, but you answered it. You answered what you answered it. Okay. Now you're walking now. So the trans space is already this conundrum space, and you decided to go into a field of acting.
Oh, Derek, I should have talked to you before I made that decision. Go ahead, ask your question.
I mean, well, I already know how this. I already know what that all entails.
Yeah.
So you know the thing about it is that because you have to think cognitively of how you want to go into this space. Are you going into this space as a trans man? Are you going into this space as a cisgender man? Like, what are you? Because then if you go into this space as a trans man, so then now they're saying that's all I can be. You know, and so then if you go into a space as a cisgender man, are you saying, am I discounting a part of me that I'm not? So were all these questions in your mind when it was time when you made this decision?
They were. All those questions were there. I didn't really, at the time that I started acting, which was probably like 2016. So this was before, in fact, this was just before Brian Michael Smith had booked Queen Sugar. So we hadn't seen a Black trans masculine role on TV at all. And then this in particular role comes out. And then my first role that I end up booking that's via TV and film ends up being Law & Order SVU. And so it is a trans character. And to be honest with you, I've been trying to figure out, like, how can I carve out my own lane? Because what I do recognize in this industry specifically, the biggest differences between quote unquote trans specific roles and roles that are not is the need to examine one's body, their gender identity, their physical space through transness, versus a role that is not necessarily centered around that. I mean, I've had opportunities to play a bank robber. I was on Blacklist and literally got to play someone who's robbing a bank. Does that mean that character's not trans? No, he totally could be. It's just not being brought up in the narrative.
Right.
So I think some of it for me has been about trying to kind of challenge not only myself, but also Hollywood and, you know, folks that are in casting offices just in general to kind of really rethink what transness means and like the way that that's showing up in a role. You know, we know that Halle Berry is a biracial actress, but does she need to be in roles that are always like centered around these sorts of ideas? Not necessarily. But I do understand like this, you know, the nuance, right, of trans actors. So there's this expectation that the moment that you start out that way, you're going to be pigeonholed. Interestingly enough, I've actually played far more roles that are not trans specific, even though the first thing that I played was a trans character. You know,
so what? I guess what was when you go into the space? When you came into the space of acting, did you just come into the space of acting as Marquise and let it be what it is, or did you mentally go into the Marquise as Marquise, a trans man, like mentally for you? What was that, or did you say I'm like? Because I know when I go into a space. Am I going into a space as Derek J? Am I going into a space as a flamboyant gay man? Am I going to the space as a sassy gay man? Like, I have to figure out how am I going to this space, because once I'm in that space, and that's how people are going to start perceiving you. So for you, what was the space that you go when you go into these things? What are the spaces you go into at?
Child, it was everything.
Right.
You know, it's kind of impossible for me to walk into the room without all of these intersections of my identity, through blackness, through transness, through being assigned female at birth, through being read as a man in the world. Like when I walk in, I'm just walking in with every single thing. Like this is it. What you're gonna see is just what you're gonna get. Hopefully my work translates well enough. You know what I mean? That I'm able to like fulfill whatever it is that you're requiring or that you're asking for. But when I walk into the room, I'm walking into the room with like every ounce of who I am. I'm not trying to take off anything or add on anything. Like this is it. I mean, at the end of the day, part of the reasons why I am actually in this space, I must admit, does involve my transness, does involve the fact that I'm Black, does, you know, involve the fact that I present the world as a man and I was also assigned female. Like all these things are true. I'm not, my interest is not to turn any element of that stuff off. I want to turn them up as much as I possibly can and pick and pull from all of that stuff. It's, I mean, honestly, it's pretty interesting to like be in a position like that where you're standing in that intersection with all of these, you know, experiences that you can pick and pull from, but they're a benefit to me. You know, hopefully people don't read it as being like, oh, we need to lock you into this because of this one sort of marker. But, you know, that's going to be a slower process just in Hollywood and I think in entertainment altogether. I mean, I'm sure you get it. There's a lot of like check-offs. Oh, gay, Black, flamboyant man, check it off. We got it. You know what I mean? And so we just stop there versus like really expanding what the conversation is.
Now, when now you're in the public eye, you're in a space now, which we had a conversation on the phone that now every time you speak, every time you have an opinion, every time you just blink, you are the representation of all trans men across the nation. Like,
first of all, no the hell I ain't. They need to stop doing that. You cannot give everyone all this responsibility, but you're right. It feels like that. You know, it feels like because you're in that position now, suddenly you're the fucking poster child for all things trans. Like, no, bitch, I'm not. I just got here.
Right.
And it's not possible for my experience to speak to every single, you know, trans guy in the fucking world. Like, what are we talking about? But you know, but I get it too. It's like the politics of what, I don't even think it's just like the politics of Hollywood. I just think it's just the world at large. People get lazy. You know, it's like, if I could mirror it to anything, it's like white folk that are like, oh, I'm not racist. I've got 5 Black friends. Right. You know, it feels like that with this Black community. So I'm like, girl, I'm not homophobic. My hairstylist is gay. Right. You know, or I'm not open to like trans communities. We've got one trans actor on the show. You know what I mean? Like there's always this need to be checking things off. And I feel like people just need to do more work. You know, you can't be lazy and just stop and be like, oh, so I got the transporter now. That's it. No, there's so much more to like open the door up for. So many more conversations to have.
So now we're in a space of, because me and my co-host of my other show, we were talking about this yesterday because Billy Porter, he made a statement about, you know, did you see Billy Porter's statement about?
I did.
Yes.
About racism in the LGBTQ community in relation to Black communities, yes.
Yes. So, you know, for me, and I'm asking your opinion on the comment also, but for me, I understood everything that he was saying. And I do agree with it. What I disagreed about the conversation is that with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter movement has its own agenda. That just that you know, all Black people is folded into this, right? You know, and when you look at it, their agenda doesn't fit the LGBTQ agenda at the moment. Meaning, what I mean by it,
I'm here.
I mean by it, but this is why I like to have dialogue and conversation. But what I mean by it is that it's police brutality, systematic racism, all that great stuff, right?
Yes.
What I feel that what Billy Porter was speaking to was a Black community issue, where the Black community has let down the LGBTQ community, I feel. And I feel that that's a community issue that we got to deal with. And I think that for what all this is going on right now, just like anything else, just like me being a gay man on TV, you being a trans man on TV, Black Lives Matter on TV right now. So guess who gets to burn up all the Black community's issue is Black Lives Matter. It's like Black Lives Matter don't care about us. It's like no, it's not Black Lives Matter, because when you go to the rally, if you want to go march in the street, they don't stop you and say, "Are you trans? Are you gay? Are you?" And they say, and if you say yes or no, they say, "Well, you need to move over here because we're not really marching with you today." They let you march because the
cause is that right?
Because the cause is for this,
Right.
Because then when I thought about it more, and I'm just like, really, if we're going to talk about what it is, it's LGBTQ and it's women. Hell, Black people, like we so everybody can complain about their sectors as not being, done. But I'm like, we got to deal with this systematic shit first, and then we got to work down on our thing. That was just my take from it, and I would like to hear yours.
So I do stand in alignment with you and your sentiments around Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I get it from an organizational standpoint. I know what their mission statement is. I believe it to be as inclusive as it could possibly be, right? Just in terms of the language. The issue is not Black Lives Matter, the organization. The issue is Black communities real time while we're going through what it is that we're going through. Mm-hmm. So I recognize the need to have all these conversations. The only frustration that I do have, because of course I've been watching your show, I've been seeing the comments, that people have had. Mm-hmm. I've watched T.S. Madison's lives, and I've seen some of the comments, and quite a few, to be honest with you, where there's this sort of consistent theme coming from cis straight Black communities that somehow queer communities need to wait. Mm-hmm. My frustration is, it is possible to have both things happen at the same time. I come from the world of yes and. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's easier for me to do that because my experience, all of it is yes and. It's all the stuff and everything else in between. Those things are true for me. I also kind of feel maybe a little frustrated with people who have these sort of sentiments about right now that doesn't matter because police are attacking Black folks just as a community as a whole, which I recognize is true. Mm-hmm. The reality is that we can't turn off and turn a blind eye to Black trans women being attacked and killed and murdered by Black trans men, or excuse me, by Black cis men. Right. So this idea, this narrative of queer communities have to wait, and more specifically that Black trans women have to wait. Well, what exactly do they have to wait for? Mm-hmm. Should they be waiting for Black straight men to stop killing them and assaulting them? Or should they be waiting for police to do their job, investigate, and make arrests, catch, all while killing Black folks? Do you get what I'm saying? So I get this, it's a pretty real thing. And I must admit, it's standing in my own shoes. These are things that I'm also always thinking about. Mm-hmm. The idea that I'm presenting in the world as a Black man. So yes, there's this added layer of scarcity in terms of the way that I'm walking around in the world, fearful when it comes to police, but then also having to think about what it means if someone who's cis and straight finds out that I'm also trans, who's Black. Mm-hmm. It's a really, I don't know. I just feel like it's a really weird position to be in, and to be told that you need to wait and we can't have this conversation now. When do we have this conversation? I would imagine that Black folk feel the same way, around police telling them this is not the way that you need to be handling protesting, that you can't protest this way, or people should be waiting to go to the fucking polls. You should go and vote and change policy instead of burn shit down. Well, Black people in this country have been attacked and fucking lynched, from the moment that we got here. Yeah. Literally, all of us. So the idea that we have to continue to wait. So you're feeling that coming from the government systems, the administration, just the whole ideology of white supremacy and what that is. And I saw this interview on MIC. It's a Black trans woman. Her name is Elle Hearns. She said something that was like so profound to me. This idea of like white supremacy is like this big ass house. Transphobia is like a small room inside of that house. So like the residual effect and rollover of what that is, even in Black community, where somehow cis straight Black folk don't feel it necessary to bring these conversations to the light around queer Black bodies because of the sense of lack of value. This idea of superiority. But I get it. This is what privilege affords. People who are privileged in this way, they're afforded the luxury of being ignorant because it doesn't apply to them. So they don't have to think about that. So you can continue to wait. Meanwhile, girls like Ayanna Dior, she needs to be subjected to violence, you know, in the form of a fucking death mob. That is crazy. That is really bizarre to me that we're not having that conversation enough. You know, fortunately you have this platform, so I know that you're intentional about doing that, but I just think it really feels like just pure bigotry to be asking for police to like treat Black bodies with respect when we don't treat Black bodies with respect. Like at some point we have to challenge each other. Yes.
That I agree with. And I think it's a little bit more eloquently said, other than yelling into a camera.
It's hard though, you know. I get it. Everybody's out here just trying to live their life, you know, trying to make it, trying to survive, be happy, you know. And there's all these systems that oppress us in so many different ways. I get it. When people have access to some kind of space, they don't really want to give up that space. You know, they really don't. I mean, even in entertainment, I'm sure you understand, like being in this industry, it feels like sometimes for me, you know, queer Black folk and just queer communities in general that are in entertainment, it feels a lot like blackface. The expectation is that we have to be performative and we can't be anything else. You know, at some point you get tired of that. You don't want to fucking walk around just performing all the goddamn time. You're a human being too.
I agree. So my last question for you is that it took you, because you're 38 or 37 now.
I'm 39.
Oh, you're 39.
Yeah, I'm about to be 40. Let's go.
So you're 39 years old, and you've been through a lot of experiences, and you've grown to become the man that you are today. Out of a scale of 1 to 100, you know, 1 being the worst, 100 being the best. When you could say, I love Marquise and who he is, how assured are you of that?
I would say at least 90%. You know, the other 10 is like things that anybody is just going to be always working on, things that you don't like. I mean, at least for myself, it's, oh God, it could be, I don't know, smoking cigarettes. I've been trying to kick this for the longest. So that's a thing. Trying to be mindful about not locking myself into language. I think for so many years, I've tried to do that thing. It just doesn't make any sense. So giving myself the freedom to just exist and evolve. Right? Like that was the first thing that I said starting out. Like I'm always evolving. So I need to allow myself the room to do that and not feel like somehow I've become some uniquely different creature just because I'm allowing myself to grow and develop and change in ways that, you know, they speak to me. But yeah, I'd say at least 90.
So that you got, like you said, you got that room to grow and evolve.
That's all I can do.
Marquise, I want to say thank you so much for taking this time out. We've been chatting for a good old hour. You know,
I know. Thank you for your time.
No, thank you, and then thank you for explaining and understanding that. Well, you know, the one thing I would say that I learned that I gained from it is the language. And, you know, saying the language just determines a lot. Even if you didn't mean it. But it's just the language that how it was presented determines a lot, and it's time for Black trans people just to take time to educate our cis people and our gay people. I mean, because I can say, yeah, hell, we don't know nothing either, child. We be sitting around here looking crazy too. Like, you know, I told you, my straight girlfriend, my cis girlfriends, they come and say, hey, what is this? And I'm like, well, hell, I don't know. Like, I mean, they're like, ain't y'all all family? I'm like, yeah, but they like our cousins. Like,
but this is great. This is why your platform, I think, is so unique and it's so amazing because you have an opportunity to like educate people across the board. Cis straight folk, queer folk, gay women, trans men, trans women, whoever, you know what I mean? Each of us are just kind of learning as we go. So it's cool. I love it. Keep it up.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm gonna drop you down while I do my closings, but stay right here, okay?
Yes.
You guys, well, thank y'all for rocking with me for another week of Gay Like Me Live. That was Marquise Vilsón. I think I said it right. But he's shaking his head. I said it right. Okay. But you know, I want to be able to have all these different conversations, and I'm excited to have these conversations. Next week I will be talking to LaShawn Dawson, and why I really made it a point to talk to him is because I think that we as Black people have a vision of what masculinity is supposed to be, and when somebody steps outside but somebody steps outside the box of what we think masculinity is, then we don't see them. We don't think that they can be masculine and this at the same time. You feel like if you're this, then you got to be this, but you never can be masculine. So, and you know, I'm at fault at that because, like, you know what, y'all come in next week and I can explain and y'all see what and y'all can understand what I'm talking about next week. But thank you guys for staying with me and chatting with me and listening to me. Next week, Wednesday, we do have the LGBTQ and the church conversation. So that's going to be quite interesting for our digital panel. And then next week, Thursday, I have LaShawn Dawson. So I will see you guys next week.